Last video, we went through the configuration of a custom action with a get endpoint method. This video, we'll look at the slight changes to that process when creating a post or patch method. A post method is best used when making a new resource at the API endpoint. This may be creating a new customer record in your database, a new meeting in your meeting scheduler, or simply logging call information. A patch method updates individual fields of a record while maintaining the other fields of original information. Note that this is different than a put method, which replaces a record entirely. While the configuration process for these methods is mostly the same as the get method, there are some key differences. I'm Carson Long from Synthflow. Let's get started. For our example today, we'll use a post method. Navigate to Actions and Custom Actions and create a new custom action. And here, we'll select a post endpoint method. Add your endpoint URL just like before, but unlike the get method, where we might be trying to access information based on an identifier, the post method doesn't often require that. Instead, the post method uses the API request to provide all of the necessary information for the creation of a new resource. In our example here, we're going to create a new customer record based on the information gathered by the AI assistant during the call. I'll be using this resource to easily test this function. They provide an API endpoint and simple documentation for us to create this action. We'll populate the API endpoint, and in our case, no headers are required. The authentication tab is configured the same way as before. Toggle it on if needed and provide the necessary authorization details like an API key or a bearer token. In our example, no authentication is needed. In the Configure tab, you'll notice that there's a big difference here. We still have variables, which operate in the same way as before, but we no longer have access to query parameters. The most important part of this screen is the JSON body. This is the formatted package of information sent to the API endpoint to create a new resource. It's important that you're aware of exactly how the API endpoint is expecting information, especially in regards to field names and data types and nested values and required fields. Getting this information wrong in your JSON body may lead to difficulty in testing. Pay attention to your API documentation. Let's create an example. Looking at my API documentation, I can see the different fields that each user has in the database. We're going to create a new record with the customer's first name, last name, and address. I'll create a variable for each piece of information that will be sent to the API endpoint. First name, last name, and then the various fields for an address. An address field for the street address, then the city and state and postal code. Each variable gets a name, a description which tells the AI how to identify information from the call to be stored in the variable, a data type, and an example value for testing. For more information on the configuration of variables, refer to the previous video on the get method custom action. Also note that the names for each of my variables are the same as the fields in my database. This isn't required, but it just helps keep things organized. Let's start to fill out the custom action body. You'll notice that there are a pair of curly brackets in this text field. JSON packages all of its information into an object. These curly brackets mark the start and the end of the object. We will be adding fields and values in between these curly brackets. My API stores the first name of the customer in a field called first name. The key is surrounded in double quotes. We define the value of that key with a colon, followed by the data that should be stored in this field. A value with the data type string is also surrounded in double quotes. Our variable, placed in those double quotes, is then surrounded in angled brackets, like all variables should be. Lastly, each key value pair ends with a comma, Follow your API documentation for all of these formatting rules, and don't worry, once you complete your JSON body, we have a feature to help you format everything correctly. More on that later. Some values in your database might be nested, and this means that a single field expects multiple values inside of it. For example here, the address field contains all of the individual parts of the address. To create a nested field, use curly brackets to create a single object with multiple parts, separating each key value pair with commas. You'll note that this formatting is the exact same as what we were doing before, but within an additional pair of curly brackets. Refer to your API documentation regarding the formatting of different data types. In most cases, number data types are not surrounded in double quotes, but strings are. But it all comes down to that specific data type. Looking at the API documentation for my dummy JSON resource, you can tell that some values are strings, surrounded by double quotes, and some are not. That needs to be reflected in your JSON body. If your JSON isn't valid, you'll see a prompt to click on that will attempt to fix your formatting and commas and double quotes. Review the body one last time before we move on. If you are configuring a patch method, this JSON body will include only the fields of information that need to be updated. A patch method also includes a way to identify the record to update. Check your API documentation for the recommended way to do this. In many cases, you may have to create a variable for identifying information for the customer and then append it to the API endpoint in some way. It might look like this. For the sake of our example though, I'll remove this variable and go back to the original configuration. In the General Settings tab, give this action a name, a description, and a phrase for the AI agent to read while this action runs. And finally, we get to the Action Results tab. Initialize the action to confirm that you get a successful operation. If you do, you'll see a status of success. In my case, the API returns all of the data of the newly created user through this post method, including the fields that weren't populated. They remain a null value. But we can see that the values I did provide are there. Not every API will do this, so don't worry if you don't see it. If possible, check that your customer data has been written into your API endpoint database. And that's it for the configuration of the custom action. To use this action in an AI agent, close out of this custom action and open up an AI agent. Navigate to the actions, select during the call, and find the action that you just created. With this action added to the AI agent, we simply need to navigate to the prompt and tell the agent when to run this action. For actions that require the agent to gather information on the call, make sure that you give the AI agent time and opportunity to collect the information before prompting them to run the post custom action. And then finally, your post custom action is complete and ready to use. This whole process is the same with the patch custom action. Creating a post or patch custom action requires a bit more technical skill than the get method because you're writing that JSON body. If your post custom action is not successfully running, check your API endpoint URL, authentication details, and the JSON body that your API documentation is expecting. These are the most common errors you may encounter. In the next video, we'll look at pre-made custom action templates that you can easily import and implement into your AI agents from the marketplace.